So welcome everybody to this month's Contact Center Network, where we're talking about the Consumer Duty Act and all the things that are happening over the next months and 12 months around all the different things that are happening within Consumer Duty. And what I've seen quite often when we're talking about that is we talk about the regulatory side of it and what we need to do and how we need to be prepared for it. But what I've not seen people discuss in much detail is the cultural impact that Consumer Duty has on the people that work in the contact center. We've heard lots about all the different things that we need to prepare for and all the tools and all the materials and all the information about products, etc. But we've not really looked at how culturally that impacts people in the workplace and some of the ways that we're going to have to measure that and monitor that operationally, and some of the things that that throws up in the contact center around virtual we're all virtual, about vulnerable customers and actually vulnerable agents. So we're going to look at this in a slightly different lens today, and I've got some great panelists with me that can help me interrogate that subject in a little bit more detail. So I've got Danny Wareham, who's a culture strategist from Fergun, and I'll let you introduce yourself in a second, Danny, and do a much better version than I've done there. And we've got Chris Jones from VCX, who is a vulnerable customer and regulatory specialist. So two people really that can help us interrogate some of the whys and wherefores of what actually sits behind Consumer Duty from a different lens. So Danny, I'm going to hand over to you and let you introduce yourself. And then Chris will come to you, and then we'll head into the meat of today's session. So Danny, welcome to the Contact Center Network.
Thank you, Gary, and welcome to everybody. My name's Danny Wareham, and I'm the founder of Fergun, who are a consultancy that believe that happy bees make tasty honey. If you have the right people with the right tools in the right environment, with the right support and culture, then your commercial performance is a side effect of that. And I help organizations understand what's sitting below the behaviors that you see in your organizations so that you can align them more cleverly to your strategy and be more successful and create high-performing environments. So that's a bit of a blur, but happy bees make tasty honey.
I'm glad you did that, Danny, because one, I've been saying your surname wrong for so long, and I've actually been pronouncing your business wrong for so long as well. So
it's not an English word. It's fine. It's absolutely fine.
Well, welcome to the Contact Center Network. Chris, I'll let you introduce yourself, and hopefully I've been saying VCX right.
It sounds all right to me, Gary. Thank you very much. We set up VCX a couple of years ago, based on 4 or 5 years of experience working for one of the big banks and in a contact center, 200 or 300 people in Aylesbury. And the big challenge that we got in 2018 was roll out this policy about the fair treatment of vulnerable customers. And it was a roller coaster. It's emotional. It didn't go down well. And we tried to take all that experience and help businesses now to have that conversation around vulnerability, what it is, what it isn't, and why we should take it seriously.
Brilliant. So it's good to have you on the Contact Center Network today. And what I want to do, just as we start today's session, I know a lot of us work in regulated, non-regulated industries, and this might affect you, it might not affect you, but for those people that are going through change with Consumer Duty and how they're making it part of their business, I want you to just have a find of the chat button, which should be to the left of your share screen icon. And I just want you to drop into the chat there, maybe one of the challenges or some of the frustrations or some of the risks that you see for organizations implementing different policy, different procedures as part of the Consumer Duty Act. And I just want to hear some of the themes that are coming in. Either might be a challenge, might be an observation, might be a top tip. So share them in the chat, because what we'll do is we'll come back to those a little bit later when we have the Q&A as part of today's session. But what I thought might be useful before we do that is for those that haven't been privy to Consumer Duty or don't necessarily know what Consumer Duty is, where have you been? I just thought it'd be useful to probably give some backdrop and some context as to what Consumer Duty is. So this is today's session, a little bit more about FAB, which I'm not going to go into because everybody knows me by now. But what is Consumer Duty and where does it originate from? So the overarching principle of the Consumer Duty Act is that a firm must act in good faith to deliver good outcomes for retail clients. Now, that sounds pretty obvious when you say it like that, but clearly there has been some behaviors and maybe some ways of working historically that the FCA have said, actually, we don't want people to work in that way, or we want to put policies in place that protect the customer, the consumer, the retail client, that help them navigate through some of the complexities that are different types of products and services that we sell. And what they've said across that, there are some cross-cutting rules. So obviously, in line with the principle, act in good faith towards retail consumers, avoid causing foreseeable harm to retail customers, and enable and support retail customers to pursue their financial objectives. And again, when you think about those, they're all fairly obvious things that you would expect financial firms and businesses to adhere to. But when you're the consumer, you're not necessarily as savvy and as rich in information as we have when we would be selling, renewing, or servicing products. So what the FCA have said is that in order to deliver those cross-cutting rules, we need to think about 4 key outcomes, and that's how our products and services are constructed, the price and the value that we offer as a business, how much our customers, our consumers, understand what they're buying into, and importantly, in a contact center environment, is how we support them either during the sales process, post the sales process, whilst they're being serviced, or whilst they're being renewed. So what does that support metric look like? So I thought it might be useful just to share some examples here of what that means when we break out into those brackets there, those 4 customer outcomes. We talk about these things here. We talk about allowing consumers to be equipped to make effective decisions. So getting that information that they have right at the time that they need it in a way that they clearly understand it. Then I think the key piece that pulls us together as a contact center industry is how we then service those customers. So the service that we provide to them, how responsive we are, the channels by which they can contact us, how customers want to be communicated to. So what does that customer support look like? And how easy is it to navigate across the purchasing process versus the complaints process versus the renewals process? How often do we see it really easy to buy something, but then when we actually want to use the service or we want to move away from that service, it becomes increasingly difficult? So that's where that outcome comes in. And then there's around how we actually, the products and the services, how we actually price them and how fair that new business pricing is versus when we come to renewal. And that we've all heard that phrase, haven't we? New customers only. So this principle is there to really give some guidance in loose terms, because we know the FCA never really gives advice or tells us what to do, but they give us some frameworks as to how we want to approach that. And those 2 principles there is how we sell those products and services needs to be fair, and we need to protect customers from unreasonable high fees and charges. Maybe tell that to the oil and gas industry at the moment, but that's a different story. But ultimately, as part of that, we need to make those products fit for purpose. So they need to be constantly reviewed and they need to be constantly evaluated to say, actually, do they deliver on the needs that customers have at this moment in time? Or should we be ending some of those products? And should we be looking at how those closed products actually need to be either closed down or migrated across onto new products because they're not fit for purpose? So that, in an overarching summary, gives us a bit of a flavor of what the Consumer Duty Act is. And you can understand already from everything that I've just said, how some of that challenge might be around support, culture, people, process, and all those training items. And I thought it'd be useful just for clarity to give the timeline of what some of the consumer duty timelines are. And we're already approaching quite a significant deadline, which is the end of October. That should say 2022 rather than 2002. So it's that implementation plan being in place. And then the next milestone is towards the back end of April. So we just need to make sure that all outcomes are compliant against those 4 metrics. And then in effect, it goes live, big bang, 2023 at the end of July. But that does make you think when you look at those timelines and when you look at that request, it makes you think about what are the impacts to our people in the contact center and across the different areas in the contact center. what the metrics are and how that's going to change in terms of that consumer support mechanism. And we've already seen some of those changes happening in France already, just recently. We've seen some of those changes happen in Spain with some laws being put into place in terms of how long we can take to answer a customer. And then we need to think about what the knock-on impacts there are of doing all those things on the culture in the organization. And to help us tackle this today, I've got my my trusty panelists in Danny and Chris. So I'm going to stop sharing there, and I'm going to start by thinking about some of the questions that we've got within the contact center and some of the things that we've seen. And Chris, I'm going to come to you first, but we've heard a lot about consumer duty, and I've just given a bit of a whirlwind summary there. But what, in your mind, in terms of what consumer duty is, what does it include, and what do you mean? What do you think it means to you as an individual and to the industry and the customer overall?
Thanks, Gary. I think sometimes it's helpful in just listening to your summary there, particularly with an audience that's not all financial services, and listening to that with the ears that, yeah, what does this really mean from an outsider looking in? If you think of all the things that were bad about the missale of payment protection insurance and how you were hounded by CMCs to say that you couldn't claim, you weren't eligible, you were forced to take it, you didn't understand it, all of that stuff is what consumer duty is attempting to rectify. Because the nub of it was, back in the 80s, financial service institutions were trusted by and large. And then we went through this period of the way we incentivize banks, building societies, high streets, advisors, all that sort of thing, to sell products, is what caused all of the bad behaviors, and that consumers came off worse. They were no longer getting sound and fair advice based on their needs. They were being sold products because somebody was incentivized to do so. And the industry lost trust, it lost its reputation. And I think from the outside looking in, this is the regulator trying to do what it can to make sure that businesses are held to account, to represent the consumers and provide consumers with valuable products which offer services that people need. People need financial products. And where the regulator, particularly in financial services, I think is a bit different, is they say that, you know, the products that we sell are really complicated. Most people don't understand their own mortgage. If they really picked it apart and you said, you know, how does the interest rate actually calculate? Like, I don't know, I'll just read the summary. So not only are they complicated, they have long-term implications. So how can we be held to account to put the consumer first, design products which are flexible, not for an average consumer or an average persona, and take some responsibility for that? And the big issue with this really is the way that they're going to try and measure that, because a lot of the talk is about how can we evidence that we're not allowing customers to experience harm? How can we evidence that customers are getting good outcomes? And outcomes measurement is not quite as easy as, you know, number of calls per hour or something like that. So yeah, there's a lot of talk about how we're going to find the data, how we're going to interpret the data, and how that's going to be actually something meaningful, which tells us something about customers, and particularly customers that have diverse needs or vulnerabilities or characteristics where they're more likely to not understand what it is that they're buying.
I'm going to come back to some of those points that you've made there, Chris, because I think you've made some really interesting ones, particularly around data, MI, metrics and outcomes. Before we do that, Danny, from your point of view, having not necessarily been in the thick of the, I suppose, the retail environment. In fact, you have been in the retail environment, haven't you? I stand corrected. What's your view on some of the changes that are coming down the line on consumer duty and the impacts that it's going to have on people?
So my view is slightly from a different lens, Gary, compared to Chris, because we've been through regulatory changes before. So you think not too long ago we had GDPR changes that meant that contact centers had to ask about marketing preferences, and you couldn't auto opt people in. And there was a group of organizations that approached that from a compliance viewpoint. How do we measure, have we asked these people if we can opt them into our newsletters and marketing, etc.? And the way that the environment, the training and the support for the employees was set up was very compliance orientated. Actually, the companies that were very successful at being able to add their consumers to marketing were the ones that built those conversations as relationships to show the value in why you should be part of our marketing. And for me, the changes around consumer duty have a lot of parallels in that on one side, we have to be able to demonstrate that we've followed a particular process and we've ticked some boxes to make sure that we've identified vulnerabilities, that we know what vulnerabilities are, etc., which I'm not a big fan of the word in particular. But on the flip side, actually, this is a good thing for consumers, and how we articulate that within our own organizations to show the value that it actually adds to our organization's relationship with our consumers is a good thing. And there's a real opportunity there to embed that within our cultures to show that we actually care about the customer as a person rather than the process that the FCA has foisted upon us.
Yeah. And I think that's a really interesting point. And if I was to ask you in terms of the benefits that you talk about there and the impact on culture, what would you say is one of the key things that you would be looking at as an organization in trying to adapt to that benefit and that culture?
Well, if we park consumer duty for the moment and imagine it's not happening, I don't feel that many people would think that it's a bad idea to understand our customers and then to tailor your service approach to them. So, for example, if you have offshore outsource partners that deal with your UK customers, you'll have processes in place to make sure that the standard of language, for example, or the internet connection speed so they can administer the services is acceptable. The same thing for me applies for consumer duty. All we're doing is identifying, does this particular consumer on this particular transaction need more support? And that might be because of a temporary vulnerability. It might be English might not be their first language, or it might be something that's closer to sort of protected characteristics in a diversity sense. So tailoring your service to a specific customer interaction is just great service. Yeah. And that's where the value is for me.
Yeah. And I think it's that whole customer service experience. I mean, we talk about customer experience, but quite often we lump customer experience into a marketing conversation. Whereas actually, I think what this is allowing us to think about is what are the service points that we want to have within the contact center, and how do we utilize consumer duty and the requirements of that to bolster that service and bolster that experience. So I think that's a really great point. Chris, from your perspective and thinking about what firms need to consider when evaluating the change to both customer service experience and employee experience, what are the key things that firms are going to have to think about when transitioning from one way of working to another?
Okay, so before I answer that, I'm just going to read, because it just as you were saying there, just reminded me that FCA Director Sheldon Mills, he made a speech at the end of September where he's quoted as saying, "Be in no doubt, the duty will be a significant shift in what we expect of firms. It means making lasting changes to culture and behaviour, and to consistently deliver good outcomes." So I think it kind of picks up on what, that the FCA are definitely talking about culture. They're not just talking about outcomes. We've got a bit focused on the outcomes, and that's going to happen. Firms have to do that. So how you go about collecting your data, what data you collect, how you're going to make it meaningful, that has to happen. It has to be in your implementation plan, and it has to make sense. Where I worry is that the data then drives the culture rather than the culture driving the data, because at the moment, particularly at the moment, in the cost of living crisis, where we have huge vulnerability, lack of resilience, call it what you like, additional needs in the consumer marketplace, the people in the call center are having to deal with more emotionally charged conversations, which are difficult. The people that are writing the consumer duty implementation plans probably don't sit in the call center, and the people that are signing them off sit in a boardroom, and that's my concern. I think that the businesses will shift in how they collect data and present it to the regulator, because that's what businesses do. There are a few out there that will say, wow, what a great opportunity to really kind of showcase what an amazing organization that we are. But they're already doing that by and large. Where I worry about it is if the data collection just ends up back in the call center as more metrics. And if you don't know, the FCA statistic that gets banded around for UK adult customers exhibiting one or more characteristics of vulnerability is around 50%. So the worst case scenario is that you suddenly turn up to work in your call center and you say, well, actually, how many customers have you identified as vulnerable this month? You might say, well, one out of how many calls? Well, I don't know, 100, 150. Well, it needs to be half the calls. So that's a concern, but that's what potentially is the biggest challenge. It's, yes, we need to evidence it. Yes, we need to get the data, but if you're not collecting it digitally, and our focus is very much on that human to human contact, how are you doing that in the right way?
And I think you raise a really good point, and charities also reference some of this in terms of technology in the chat. I think there's a couple of pieces to think about for firms when they're looking at those metrics and starting to beat people up with a stick to say, all right, you've only registered 50% of your customers. We think that might be higher. Actually, the validation point behind that sits in the technology that we use around speech analytics, text analytics, all the key kind of QA touch points where we're identifying either through complaints journeys or through customer feedback that potential risk of vulnerability. But I think at the same time, and what goes through my head with some of this, is the Consumer Duty Act is there to protect customers, and it really helps reinforce the vulnerability piece. And I think that vulnerability regulation, if you like, is becoming much stronger. But at the same time, we've got agents that are now becoming more vulnerable. So we've got vulnerable agents dealing with vulnerable customers.
Our office manager,
Danny, from your perspective, Karen, I'm just going to say, thank you very much. Danny, I'm just going to ask from your perspective, thinking about that in mind with vulnerable customers and consumer duty and the requirements that it brings on a firm, how do firms need to consider their vulnerable agents in that same setting? And I know this isn't maybe one that we planned for, but we're going a bit off beat. So what would your thoughts be on that topic?
So you're right, this conversation could grow some arms and legs around well-being in general, but to keep it broadly narrow, kind of keep it on topic, but bring it in a little bit, it's very similar to the way that we should potentially be looking at the consumer duty, in that if we're tailoring our approaches to suit the individual needs of a consumer, from a well-being and from an employee experience point of view, employee experience being the individual touch points with our people, then those should be very similar. We should be tailoring the way that we have our coaching sessions, tailoring the way that we have our other kind of well-being, hopefully well-being sessions with our people, so that we can make sure that we're supporting them in a tailored way as well. The challenge potentially is where those two parties intersect, in that you have employees that are vulnerable. They would be vulnerable consumers if they were calling someone else, who are then having to have conversations and interactions with other vulnerable people. And emotional intelligence can feel like a currency, and people who are highly emotionally intelligent can take on other people's emotions. It can be physically draining. How do we put in place processes to mitigate that, or at least spot that it's happening, that our people are starting to have their own issues exacerbated by the interactions that are now being encouraged to do because of it's the right thing to do and it's legislated for.
Yeah, and Chris talked about this earlier, in the more refinement we add to the customer journey and the transactions that we do in terms of self-serve and digital, the queries that then come into the contact center become much more complex and have a much more urgent nature or a much more sensitive nature. So Chris, thinking about your expertise in vulnerability, how are you seeing organizations, I suppose, create that infrastructure that allows them to support vulnerable customers, but at the same time supports employees with what's coming down the line in terms of changes in regulation?
Yeah, that's a good question, and Danny touched on it. It's about creating the atmosphere of disclosure, and that's often where the gap analysis starts. It's like, all right, so how do we figure out what we don't know about our customers that might make them vulnerable customers? Well, encouraging those environments, conversations, atmospheres of disclosure is about driving that language, that terminology, all the way through the business. Now, I always like to look at the worst case scenario and work backwards, because I've been in the situation where the worst case, if you put yourself in enough situations, you end up in the worst case scenario. And the worst case scenario is you have a customer on the phone who has no hope for the future, and they have thoughts of self-harm or potential suicide, and they're going to share that with you. Why are they going to share that with you? Because the guy in the call center has been tasked to ask to surface vulnerability. So your business has put somebody in harm's way who is now communicating with somebody who is in harm's way. So this is a risk decision now. And I think where it's different now, and the customers that we're talking to and the conversations that we're having, 2 years ago, it was about, to a certain extent, the customer. Now it's about the agent. And now it's how do we actually make sure that, one, they're being supported. So having the capacity to be able to share that this is a really stressful job. That was a really tough call. I don't need like an extra minute in wrap. I need to take the afternoon off, and I probably need somebody to talk me down from that. Plus the fact that a lot of frontline staff, they've had training at some point, but they haven't had refresher training. It hasn't been kind of renewed. They don't have tools at their fingertips to say, all of a sudden, out the blue, I'm talking to a customer who's threatening to take their life. What do I do? Now, we provide a toolkit. There's other toolkits out there that allow you to open up a screen, open up a bit of your intranet, whatever it is, that says, here's a protocol to talk that customer through that situation. You're not responsible for what he or she does, but you're responsible for managing this situation. So we're trying to bring confidence into the call center that says, yeah, all right, we need to be prepared to have these conversations, and it's okay. And we expect you to kind of feel under some stress about this. Then how we go about supporting you then is about your own levels of coaching, your own EAP programs, your own systems that you have to actually facilitate an open and frank conversation about, we're putting you in harm's way and we want to help you, rather than this is your job as a regulatory requirement and you have to do it.
And I think that's, from my perspective, my understanding, and when I look at consumer duty, I think we look at that Consumer Duty Act and we look at those 4 outcomes, and we talk about value, we talk about price, we talk about consumer support, and it's very geared towards the consumer. But at the same time, what we're doing here is we're creating more complex conversations, more risky conversations for our frontline teams to be put in front of that. So from your point of view, Danny, when you think about culturally in a business, what they have to do to face off to that change, what do senior leaders in organizations need to do to create that support network to think about the people impact of consumer duty over, dare I say it, the customer impact of consumer duty?
And that's the golden question, isn't it, Gary? So the first thing is that the FCA is saying this is going to be a hugely fundamentally different way of working, and organizational leaders will need to keep that in mind as well. We can't, we've got targets around AHT and RAP, and we resource to those, and 80% of calls answer within 20 seconds, and all those kind of things that don't allow people to be able to have time out after a particularly intensive call. Our training sessions tend to be process driven. You know, this is how you work something through the system. This is how you flag it for and put a vulnerability flag on, rather than the kind of soft skills and the resilient skills that people are going to need if they are encouraged to be put in harm's way in these conversations. And then finally, there's been an increase in mental health awareness, and a lot of organizations have mental health first aiders. I don't feel that that's potentially strong enough of a process to actually own the kind of accountability, the responsibility for these the outputs of these conversations as well. So to answer your question, leaders need to kind of consider that if the FCA are saying that this is a completely different way of working, then actually all of our core BAU processes need to have a look at from a more humanistic eye to see what are the potential fallouts. It then becomes a balance of, ironically, risk within your business. How much flexibility do we have in our resource model? Do we have networks of experts, whether it's consultants or whether it's independent companies or whatever, to come in and help our people? Because we can't just make one of our other people wear a hat that says you're now responsible for having these sort of conversations with people that have had these sorts of conversations.
100%. And I do agree with you there. It's actually, we have to now think about the operational impacts of running the business differently.
Yeah.
So actually that handling time might be a little bit longer. That resource requirement, therefore, might be a little bit higher. The level of checking for understanding might need to be a little bit longer. So actually,
and that's the risk, Gary. So
yeah, that we don't do that.
I used the example of marketing earlier on. And an organization that I was working with, there was an impact assessment of, if we have to ask customers their permission for these marketing preferences, how many seconds are going to be added onto our average handling time? And there was obviously a cost associated with that, and the resource model needs to change and so on. So when the behavior manifested because people were incentivized around average handling time, you actually drove a behavior in your advisors not to ask. You know, it's not an opt-in, it's fine. And actually the penetration rates were really low. But that wasn't an issue because it meant you saved money on your resourcing budgets, and there's no kind of OPEX impact. So there is a risk here that if we don't have the structures in place, if we don't have that culture of caring, authentic caring, that is backed up by the policies and processes that allow people to be safe in work, then what happens is people don't follow the process. They won't ask the questions on the interactions, and it'll become a balance between what's the risk of any impact from the FCA versus what's the risk to our bottom line in resourcing for doing the right thing.
And I think that's a huge risk, that we don't consider those impacts. And when I look at some of the content that I see sometimes on LinkedIn, and when you see things, is it a value center? Is it a cost center? If you're still thinking in that cost center mode and you're in a regulated environment and you're not taking into the impacts of this, I think that's where the customer experience piece will come unstuck, which is what I want to talk to. So Darren Stokes is on the call, and Darren's made a really great point. So I just want to ask you to take yourself off mute, Darren, and just voice your comment that you put in the chat, because I think it's a really interesting one given the point that we've just made.
Yeah, so I'm a compliance guy at heart for sort of 20 years, but working much more in the operations side now. With the changes that have come along in conduct over the last sort of 6, 7, 8 years. So I've seen in webinars for the last 6 or 7 months, that's the customer experience point being raised, and how that is coming. We need to bring customer experience and conduct compliance teams closer and closer together. And the most recent webinar the FCA did, they talked about groups of customers a lot. And that, like personas and stuff, is something that we've done in CX a lot recently. But this is a very new thing for compliance functions and compliance teams and the business to sort of understand. So the marketing side, which I think we touched on, yeah, we do this all the time because we want to sell more. We want to understand what's going to drive the behaviors of those groups of customers. But to shift, and now this, as I think someone mentioned, this, the FCA calling this the paradigm shift in regulation. How do we think about the outcomes that those groups of customers are going to get when we're selling them, when we're handling claims, when we're dealing with complaints? Because this is all things that have to be thrown in. And how do you map those journeys, which we now need to think about in those journeys? What are those outcomes as well?
I think there's a real risk there as well, is that you've got a cultural shift, you've got a paradigm shift in regulation, but do we take the people on the same journey with us? And actually, do we, as a consequence, throw that needle right to the other side and become far too stringent with some of the KPIs, as Chris mentioned earlier? Now we see quality assurance scores fall in, which then drives into how team leaders behave with people, the performance management that happens in the organization. So I think the point that you've made is really, really key there, Darren. Chris, from your perspective, thinking about the compliance element and the risks associated with consumer duty and vulnerable customers and vulnerable agents, what would your thoughts on what Darren said there be to firms? What things might they need to take into consideration to handle that?
They've got to take it on. It's hard, and that's Darren's point. And the FCA know it's hard, and they put within the guidelines is that we will take a very focused view on firms withdrawing products from the market, because what they don't want is reduced choice in the marketplace, which further discriminates against people which might be difficult to manage. Because as Darren says, it's like, if my product could be construed as delivering poor outcomes for this group of people, we just won't sell it to that group of people anymore, rather than actually it's the product that's the problem, not the group of people. How do we change the product? So it is tough. I think that those external panels of groups of people who experience the products and the frustrations with them, they are key to getting back into that inclusive service-led design element that is part of the duty. It's very much, it's not, customer support is part of it, but design of products and services and fair pricing and value is just as big a part. Yeah. So I think that there's the challenge of internal communications within the organization. I think that's what it really comes down to. And I've worked in organizations where it's well, you have to do this because compliance says to. Well, but we can't say that because we want marketing to say that over here. And we've got away with that for way too long, really, depending on who's got the loudest voice or the biggest gong to bang, whatever it was. But the reality is that if we start to change our thinking, if we get the product engineers talking to the customers who have just used their product and it's not been usable for them, and say, look, this is insight, it's not criticism. How can we tweak it? Then we get the people that are actually dealing with designing the products to fix it, rather than the complaints department, because that's where it ends up. So
I think you've touched on a really interesting point, and I'd like to get Danny's view on this. Is that the change that we're asking here is quite fundamental, and quite often in the contact center industry, where this has a more of a significant impact, people are creatures of habit. They've probably been there for a long time, so this is going to take a big behavioral shift in organizations. How can firms best set themselves up, Danny, to drive that behavioral shift in a positive way that lands positively for both I suppose the customer, which is what this is intended to do, and well for the actual organization itself with its people?
And Chris used the key words there, internal comms. It's like he's reading my mind. That's where the rubber meets the road in terms of how do we translate what we're about to what we actually do? Do we walk our talk? So my challenge around compliance is that it's natural that compliance is a binary system. Are we compliant or are we not? How we get there might be through a process flow, but ultimately, see, are we compliant or are we not? People are not binary. So there is often an approach within contact centers and organizations in general that if something is binary, has a binary output, then we can use AI to do that, or we can give people process flows, and you lose the humanity of why it's important. And what internal comms can do is you can either use it to explain what the process is and what's compliant and what's not, or you can utilize it to explain what are we about, what do we believe, why do we exist as a company, what's our purpose, and then why is this process actually important? And it may produce a binary yes/no answer out the back of it, but why are we doing it is part that is often missed in internal comms. We have a kind of fire and forget. Let's just tell everybody everything. You don't need to know why. Just read it.
Let's send three emails out in quick succession and job done.
Yeah, and comms is all about same as marketing. You identify your segment of consumers and you change your message to suit that particular cohort. If we had the same approach within our internal comms fields and we understood that the context is more important than the content, actually that would resolve a huge amount of cultural issues, not just around consumer duty, but around why do I come to work? Does what I do matter? Is there a purpose and passion in what I do?
Brilliant. Darren, you've got your hand up there. I don't know whether you found the hand up button or whether you had an additional point that you wanted to raise there.
It was a bit of both, actually. I was quite instead of just sitting there like that for 5 minutes. No, it was just on that product design point, that MI point that Chris made. What's something that I've been trying to do for the last few years is, and I'd be interested to know if anybody else has done something similar. We're trying to put conduct on everybody in the business. So rather than just the contact center always gets the wrong end of the stick, I'll be polite whilst we're here, but everybody else has a part to play in this and the customer getting a good outcome. So what I've been doing for a few years now is building the sort of this dashboard and this cycle of conduct can happen at conduct risk, and good customer outcomes drives from strategy. It drives from your governance. It's your people and culture and your HR and your training, as well as product and pricing, as well as sales and service, marketing and comms. So what we do is we've built a suite of metrics around all of those. So it puts the onus on everybody to play a part in making sure that there's a focus on that right thing. And then everybody, and it's not just that end point of selling it or handling a complaint or handling a claim where the conduct bit happens, where the good outcome happens. It's all the way through, not just the product design and the selling of it, but just how we're set up as an organization to focus on this stuff. And I think that's the key thing that the regulator is driving now, with their getting the boards to sign off the implementation plan, having the board champion. It's trying to push from the top as well as coming.
I think you're right. And I think when we use that word conduct, people think, oh, conduct is about how we sell it, how we renew it, rather than how we service it. So actually, when we talk about, and as the FCA do quite often, they talk about delivering great outcomes. If we talk about it in that sense as what responsibility do you have in your sphere of that part of the customer journey to deliver a great customer outcome, I think it shifts mindset slightly. I want to come to Charity, because Charity made a great point around what I know is close to Chris's heart about human-to-human connection. So Charity, I'm just going to invite yourself to take yourself off mute and just summarize what you were saying in the chat, and then we'll debate that point a little bit, because I think it was a really good point well made.
Yeah, I was just, I guess my point was around a lot of our customers now interact via, kind of digital channels. So chat, whether that's reactive, proactive chat in many services. And so how do you build that kind of empathetic conversation and active listening skill through a digital written communication, which is still part of the contact center, right? Humans are on the end of these, but it's not voice.
Yeah. I think that's a really great point, and it leads to one of the questions that we talked about in our prep session, Chris, which is around that whole, do we run the risk in consumer duty of over-indexing on the digitization of the customer journey, which then makes it less of a human experience, less of an empathetic experience? So what's your view on what Charity said there, and how would you approach that in your kind of sphere?
I think the key thing is that people actually feel like they're listened to as an individual, and you can still do that. We've got some pilots running at the moment where we've got call center agents and web chat agents, and we have a database of vulnerability, and the pages are presented so that you can they're simple to read. You can read it in real time, and at the top of the right hand there's always something that we call a factor of familiarity. And that will normally be some kind of number or statistic. So you might say, I'm just, customer might disclose they're dyslexic, for example. And you'll be able to say, oh, that's not unusual. So a 10% of the UK population. It's, have we connected with them in a way that says, I'm listening to you and I've thought about that, and I've had some resources here that shows that I have thought about it and I care about it. And are we engaged in a conversation? Yes, we are. All right, that's good. So we're establishing a relationship of trust, not a relationship of transaction. And I think we have to look to use the digital channels where we can to do stuff which is simple and can be automated, because that gives us the capacity in the call centers to deal with the things which are not simple. And then we got to have the right people in the call center, and that's a different conversation. But it's how do we make the individual feel listened to? And I think that does come from tone of voice, the way that we express ourselves, the way that we express our business purpose, and how much our agents or our web chat keyers have actually recognized that, yeah, this is how we project ourselves as an organization. We're not using the fewest words possible to get to an outcome. We're engaging in a relationship building opportunity.
And I think specifically on that digital front, the risk is actually we might make more errors in having a voice conversation with a customer. So let's try and move them down the self-serve route. Let's try and move them down the web chat route. I think the danger with that becomes we generate clunky processes or clunky experiences for clients through poorly formed chatbots and poorly formed web chat journeys that maybe just take too long. So I think the point that the Consumer Duty Act is making is that we still can't do that either. So they're almost protecting the customer from all sides, in that if you think self-serve is the option, great, but actually you've got to make that self-serve journey and those self-serve options really user-friendly for anybody to use, so that you've got the right framework and right infrastructure of support, which I think is interesting. Lawrence Gramlich makes an interesting point, and we talked about this right at the start, in that Consumer Duty, obviously, if you're a regulated business, you've got to adhere to some of these practices. But Lawrence, your question, I'd like you to take yourself off mute and ask the question of the panel.
Thanks, Gary. Excuse me. So I guess I've been doing a bit of work around like the utilities industry and reading up on CMEX, and talked about a little bit of this on the last webinar, the forum we had. It's kind of like, you know, obviously at the minute it's focused on FCA, but to what extent will other industries take that lead? Or, you know, utilities, I use that as an example because they're regulated by Ofwat or Ofgem, you know, so they have their own regulatory bodies, but they're also quite specific about customer experience and what you must do to achieve X, Y, and Z. And how much do people think that they'll actually take the lead from this, and this be like almost a pilot for other industries rolling out this as a sort of way to deal with your customers?
I think you make a brilliant point. I almost jested about it right at the start to say maybe we should be looking at the consumer duty principles on the energy sector. But actually, they are probably at the moment the most vulnerable. And actually, energy in itself is quite complex, I find. Just trying to work out what my actual daily day rate is on my energy is equally as challenging as maybe working out what my mortgage is. So, Chris, on Lawrence's point there, what do other organizations that aren't necessarily bound by consumer duty, what learns can they take from this to approach their customers?
There is a lot happening. I just came off a call this morning that was hosted by Ofgem, and there is the priority service register that utility companies are encouraged to get as many people on as possible. And I think, you know, that sounds daft. It's like, why do I need to be on a register? Oh, so we can support you with what? When the water runs out, we'll deliver bottled water to your front door. Okay, that's good, all right? But that doesn't necessarily mean that that's the only thing that can happen. Where's the regulator that says, all right, you're on the register. No one's contacted you about getting you on a priority service tariff, because the likelihood is if you're struggling with this, you might be struggling financially. Can we put you on that tariff? That's what doesn't happen. And so I think, yes, the regulators across multiple industries, particularly utilities and communications as well, they've all got something to say about vulnerability and fair treatment of customers and delivering fair value. But it's all a bit sort of like, okay, let's capture who these people are and what their needs are, rather than let's enforce the support that the companies can give to them, and just say that, you know, if there's something like, I can't remember what the number was now, 18 million people on the priority services register across all the different kind of registers, but they're not all
they're
on
all
that
separate
tariff.
registers, right? They're not like a central register. It's pretty separate. You know, each water has one, or each individual company. You know, so
yes, and that's another very good point. If we're going to do this at scale, we need to have robust data sharing agreements that say, look, we're looking out for this customer because they have a mental health condition, they're struggling with this, or whatever it is. I'm going to share that data with the other regulators, the finance industry, the people that are trying to loan this person money, the fire service who might need to get into their house. You know, that's where we need to get a little bit more teeth from the regulators, rather than the quote was, they want to put all of the onus on the companies and take all the credit.
I think what's challenging is a lot of these people haven't loaned money or tried to borrow more money. You know, they're using the same amount of gas, electricity, water as they always were. They're just paying 3 times as much for it. So that suddenly, you know, your middle earnings, whatever, like general person would be not vulnerable, has become, like, I think they term it as like potentially vulnerable, because at any minute they could jump into this bracket of, oh, we can't pay. And that's really, really difficult to manage for the industries themselves as well, I think, you know.
I think so. I think it's a really well-made point, and it'd be interesting to see what other industries take from the changes in consumer duty. I think there's probably time for just one more question. So I think this was a really interesting one that I'd like to get Chris and Danny's view on, is does the distributed nature of contact centers now in a more remote setting make delivering or embedding consumer duty any harder? Chris, I'm going to start with you, and then I'll get Danny's view after that. So if what's your thoughts, Chris?
Yeah, definitely. I think it does. Not from a data collection point of view, because that shouldn't really make any difference, but in terms of the expectation that you're putting on that call center agent to have these emotional conversations with people, and they can no longer see their mate slamming the phone down or crying and offering some help. People are still having to kind of meet their targets. They're still putting on a brave face on a Zoom call with their team leader, and if their team leader's not, you know, bang on the money, I know Marianne would be all over this. If you like, that's where the responsibility is. If you can't see them, do something to connect with them, to figure out, you know, how they are.
So Danny, thinking about that Chris has just said, and the nature of that conversation and that question, what would be your thoughts there? What can organizations do to connect people up in a better way?
Yeah, so Chris has hit the nail on the head again. You can't see when people need support in the same way that if they were geographically this close. But the responsibility is not with the FCA, and it's not with having quality processes within our organizations. The role of every leader is to enable their people to be successful. And leadership need to really, in my opinion, leadership really need to have a look at themselves, have a mirror held up to them to say, how do we make these situations better for our people, rather than management by measurement. You know, what's the penetration rates? What's the AHT that's the result? And that is the fundamental change in how we think about business. It's what are we here for? And if I can share just on a personal level, an example, my mother is disabled, very low income. She's in rented accommodation. She has a prepay meter for her gas. And I'm in my own home, and I have a monthly direct debit. My standing charge for my gas meter is about 22 pence a day. My mum's is over £1 a day. She has a faulty meter at the moment, and she's taken a week away, and she's having to get the neighbour to come in and keep turning the lights on to make sure that the money hasn't run out, because she can't see the balance on it. Now, under the FCA regulations, if that was a financial industry, she would be classed as vulnerable, and there would be processes in place, hopefully, for those conversations to take place. But because those don't exist, and are not currently planned to exist just yet in the energy sector, it drives a completely different culture, which then drives a completely different interaction with their companies. And if we want to make a difference to that, the leaders will set the tone on what are the acceptable behaviors within this organization.
I think that is a perfectly placed point to end on. So we are at 59 minutes to the hour, so I won't keep anybody any longer than I promised with the hour long, but hopefully that's been a useful session. I think there's been some really great nuggets come from both Chris and both from Danny, and there's been some really great contributions from the audience, and the chat's been ablaze as well, which is always a good sign. I'm going to ask Chris and Danny just to stop on for a second, but to everybody else, thank you very much for joining, and we'll see you on the next one. Take care, folks.
Thank you, everyone.
Nice to meet you all.